Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. Fog, Bracken, and the Twin Stone Lanterns. The October fog rolled across the Surrey countryside like a grey tide, swallowing the ancient hedgerows and transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes that loomed and vanished in the mist. Miss Jane Marple pulled her woolen coat more tightly about her shoulders as she peered through the window of Mrs. Dolly Bantry's motor car, watching the ghostly landscape unfold before them. "Really, Jane, I do hope this expedition won't prove too taxing for you," Mrs. Bantry remarked, navigating carefully around a particularly sharp bend. "Though I must say, when Basil Lowton mentioned his lantern walk, I thought immediately of you. You do so enjoy these quaint village customs." Miss Marple smiled gently, her keen blue eyes still fixed upon the passing scenery. "How thoughtful of you, my dear Dolly. I confess I find myself quite curious about Lantern Gate. Such an unusual name for a property, don't you think? Names often tell us so much about a place's history." The fog began to thin as they approached their destination, revealing glimpses of moorland dotted with bracken that glowed amber in the late afternoon light. Presently, two imposing stone gate posts came into view, each crowned with an elaborate granite lantern carved in the Gothic style. The left lantern stood proud and straight, its weathered surface speaking of centuries of wind and rain. The right lantern, however, caught Miss Marple's immediate attention. "How very odd," she murmured, leaning forward slightly. "That lantern appears to be leaning quite noticeably. 4 inches off plumb, I should say, as if something had tugged it from below." Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze and shrugged dismissively. "Old stonework, my dear. These ancient places are always settling and shifting. Arthur was forever having to shore up something or other at Gossington Hall." Beyond the gates, a winding drive led through stands of copper beech and oak to Lantern Gate itself, a rambling Tudor manor house built of warm, honey-coloured stone. Chimneys twisted skyward from the steep roof, and mullioned windows reflected the dying light. The south wing, Miss Marple noted, appeared to be in some disrepair, with several windows boarded up and ivy claiming much of the facade. Their host, Mr. Basil Lowton, emerged from the main entrance as they drew up before the front door. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, tall and spare, with a kind of scholarly stoop that comes from years bent over books and documents. His grey hair was carefully combed, and he wore a well-pressed suit that spoke of modest prosperity and careful attention to appearance. "Mrs. Bantry, how delightful to see you again," he said, offering his arm as she alighted from the car. "And this must be the famous Miss Marple. Your reputation as a student of human nature precedes you, dear lady." Miss Marple accepted his greeting with her characteristic modesty. "Too kind, Mr. Lowton. I'm merely an old woman with perhaps too much time to observe the small details of village life." "Ah, but it is precisely those small details that illuminate the greater truths, is it not?" Lowton's eyes twinkled behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "I do hope you'll find this evening's proceedings of interest. I've invited a small group of guests to join us for our lantern walk, each with their own particular expertise or connection to the estate." As they entered the oak-panelled hall, with its carved staircase and portraits of long-dead Lowtons gazing down from darkened frames, their host continued his explanation. "As you may know, I purchased Lantern Gate only recently, having discovered through my research that it was built by my ancestor, Sir Edmund Lowton, in the 16th century. The family connection, combined with my passion for local history, made the acquisition irresistible. However, the restoration costs are proving rather more substantial than anticipated. hence tonight's fundraising endeavour. A fire crackled welcomingly in the great stone hearth, and before it stood a slight elderly woman dressed in brown tweeds. Her grey hair was pulled back severely, and she clutched a leather-bound notebook to her chest like a shield. "My sister, Miss Amy Lowton," Basil explained, guiding his guests forward. "Amy has devoted her life to cataloguing the folklore and customs of our local villages. Her knowledge of the old ways is quite unparalleled." Amy Lowton acknowledged the introduction with a brief nod, her pale eyes darting nervously between the newcomers, before returning to the safety of her notebook. Miss Marple noticed that the woman's fingers bore ink stains, and several loose papers protruded from the notebook's pages, covered in what appeared to be careful, spidery handwriting. "I trust the other guests will be arriving shortly," Basil continued, consulting his pocket watch. "We have Captain Dane, a former army surveyor who has kindly agreed to map the grounds as part of our restoration project. Miss Fenn from the BBC is considering featuring our lantern walk in a television programme about English customs. Mr. Marks, the estate agent who handled the sale, expressed such enthusiasm for the property's history that I felt compelled to invite him, and Dr. Crane, a pathologist from the county, happens to be holidaying in the area and has a particular interest in the fungi that grow so abundantly in our grounds." As if summoned by his words, the sound of motor cars could be heard approaching through the fog. Within minutes, the hall had filled with voices and the rustle of outdoor clothing being removed. Captain Rory Dane proved to be a robust man in his 50s, with the upright bearing and clipped manner of speech that marked his military background. His handshake was firm, his grey eyes sharp and assessing as they took in both the architectural details of the hall and the faces of his fellow guests. Miss Julia Venn provided a striking contrast in her fashionable London clothing and carefully styled blonde hair. She moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to being noticed, her voice carrying the crisp articulation of the BBC as she expressed her delight at the atmospheric setting. Mr. Gideon Marks, younger than the others and expensively dressed, radiated the particular brand of enthusiasm that Miss Marple had observed in those whose professional interests align fortuitously with potential profit. His manner was perhaps a shade too eager, his compliments regarding the property's potential rather too fulsome. Dr. Edith Crane, a woman of middle years with intelligent brown eyes and capable hands, carried herself with the quiet authority of one accustomed to dealing with facts rather than speculation. Her interest in the evening appeared genuinely scientific, and she had already begun examining the various fungi that grew around the entrance with the focused attention of the true specialist. As the guests assembled in the hall, sipping sherry and exchanging preliminary pleasantries, Miss Marple found herself studying the curious mixture of personalities that Basil Lewton had assembled. Each, she noted, had their own particular reason for being present, their own agenda that might or might not align with their host's stated purpose. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance an owl called mournfully across the grounds. Miss Marple shivered slightly, though whether from the autumn chill or some deeper intuition she could not have said. "Well then," announced Basil Lewton, setting down his glass with a decisive click, "shall we begin our lantern walk? The evening promises to be most illuminating." Outside, the mist swirled around the twin stone lanterns, and Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that the leaning lanterns seemed to watch their approach with ancient, knowing eyes. Chapter 2. A silhouette at the shuttered window. The lanterns cast pools of wavering golden light across the frost-touched grass as the small party made their way through the grounds of Lantern Gate. Each guest carried a traditional hand lantern, the candle flames dancing within their glass shields like captive spirits. The fog had thickened with the approaching darkness, transforming the familiar into the mysterious, and lending an almost theatrical quality to their procession. Basil Lewton led the way, his scholarly voice carrying clearly through the mist as he recounted the history of the estate. "The original Sir Edmund chose this site quite deliberately," he explained. Pausing beside a moss-covered stone marker, the twin lanterns at the gate were said to guide travellers safely through the marshlands, that once covered much of this area. Local legend claims they possess protective properties, warding off both earthly and supernatural dangers. Miss Marple, walking carefully beside Mrs. Bantry, found herself studying her fellow guests as much as listening to their host's narrative. Captain Dane moved with military precision, his lantern held at regulation height, his eyes constantly surveying the terrain with professional interest. He produced a small notebook and was making occasional sketches, presumably for his mapping project. Julia Venn hung on every word of Luton's historical commentary, occasionally asking questions that would clearly provide excellent material for a television feature. Her fashionable shoes, Miss Marple noted, were hardly suitable for tramping across uneven ground, yet she maintained her composure with admirable determination. Gideon Mark stayed close to their host, nodding enthusiastically at each historical detail and making observations about the property's potential that seemed calculated to please. Dr. Crane, meanwhile, had fallen slightly behind the group, her attention caught by patches of unusual fungi that glowed with a faint phosphorescence in the lantern light. Amy Lowton walked in near silence, her notebook clutched tightly, occasionally murmuring what sounded like fragments of old rhymes or sayings. Miss Marple caught the words, "When lanterns fail and shadows creep," before the wind carried the rest away. "Now, if you'll direct your attention to the south wing," Basil continued, raising his lantern toward the darker portion of the house, "you'll notice that section has been sealed for the better part of 50 years. The last family to occupy Lantern Gate found the wing unsuitable for habitation, though the precise reasons had been lost to time." The south wing loomed before them, its Tudor chimneys stark against the fog-shrouded sky. The windows on the ground floor had been boarded up with weathered planks, while those on the upper floor were fitted with heavy wooden shutters that had warped and darkened with age. Ivy covered much of the stonework, giving the entire structure a sense of abandonment and decay. "Such a pity," Julia Venn remarked, raising her own lantern higher. "The architecture is quite remarkable. Those mullioned windows must once have been beautiful." "Indeed," Basil agreed, "though I'm afraid the cost of restoration would be prohibitive. The structural survey suggests significant problems with the roof timbers, and there are concerns about the stability of the upper floors." It was at that moment that Mrs. Bantry gave a sharp intake of breath. "Good heavens, did you see that?" All eyes turned toward the shuttered second-floor window that Mrs. Bantry indicated with a trembling finger. For just an instant, a tall shadow had moved across the sealed opening, clearly visible as a dark silhouette against what appeared to be a faint light within. "Optical illusion, surely," Basil said quickly, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "The fog plays tricks with light and shadow, particularly around old buildings. The angle of our lanterns, perhaps, creating reflections." Captain Dane stepped forward, his military bearing evident as he studied the window with professional attention. The movement appeared quite deliberate, he observed. Not the random play of shadows, but a human figure crossing from left to right behind the shutters. "Impossible," Gideon Marks interjected with a nervous laugh. "The wing has been sealed for decades. No one could possibly be inside." Dr. Crane looked up from her examination of a particularly interesting specimen of bracket fungus. "Could it perhaps be a bird that has found its way inside? A large owl or heron might cast such a shadow." Amy Luton had gone very pale, her grip on her notebook white-knuckled. "The old stories speak of watchers," she whispered, "guardians who walk the sealed passages when strangers approach." "Really, Amy," her brother said with forced heartiness, "we mustn't alarm our guests with such fanciful tales." Miss Marple said nothing, but her sharp eyes remained fixed on the window in question. As the others debated the nature of what they had seen, she noticed something that the excitement had caused them to overlook. There, barely visible through a gap in the shutters, was the faint glow of what appeared to be a single candle flame, guttering low as if nearly spent. The party moved on, following Basil's predetermined route through the walled garden and around the ornamental pond. But the atmosphere had subtly changed. Conversation became more subdued, and Miss Marple noticed that several guests cast nervous glances back toward the sealed wing as they walked. The legend of the protective lanterns is particularly interesting, Basil continued, clearly attempting to restore the evening's scholarly tone. Local folklore suggests that as long as the twin lanterns burned at the gate, no harm could come to those within. Of course, such beliefs were common in an age when the distinction between the natural and supernatural was far less clearly defined. How fascinating, Julia murmured. Though her earlier enthusiasm seemed somewhat dampened, these old superstitions often contain kernels of historical truth, don't they? As they passed beneath a grove of ancient oak trees, the fog seemed to thicken further, reducing visibility to mere yards. The lantern flames flickered more wildly in the increased dampness, and somewhere in the distance came the mournful cry of what might have been a night bird, or perhaps something less easily identified. The marshlands I mentioned earlier, Basil explained, bred all manner of strange phenomena. Marsh lights, unexplained sounds, sudden fogs that could disorient the most experienced traveller. Small wonder that our ancestors attributed supernatural significance to such occurrences. Captain Dane had stopped to examine one of the stone boundary markers, his surveyor's eye noting details that others might miss. Interesting construction, he commented. These markers appear to be far older than the house itself, possibly medieval or even earlier. You have a good eye, Captain, Basil replied. The estate incorporates elements from several historical periods. Sir Edmund built upon an existing foundation, as was common practice. There are suggestions that this site may have been of religious significance long before the Loughton family claimed it. They completed their circuit of the grounds and returned to the welcoming glow of the main house, but Miss Marple found herself glancing back once more at the south wing. The candlelight she had observed earlier was no longer visible, yet she remained certain of what she had seen. As they gathered in the oak-panelled hall, removing their outdoor clothing and warming themselves before the fire, the conversation inevitably returned to the mysterious shadow at the window. I remain convinced it was merely an optical effect, Basil maintained, pouring glasses of warming brandy for his guests. Old buildings, particularly in fog, can create the most extraordinary illusions. Perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, accepting her glass with a grateful smile, though I couldn't help but notice that there appeared to be a candle burning in that sealed room. Just a small flame, visible through the gap in the shutters. A momentary silence fell over the group. Gideon Marks cleared his throat nervously. Surely not possible, Miss Marple. Who could have lit such a candle? And how would they have gained access to a sealed wing? An excellent question, Mr. Marks, she replied gently, though I find that in my experience, when something appears impossible, it often simply means we haven't yet discovered the correct explanation. Amy Loughton looked up from her notebook, her pale eyes bright with an emotion that might have been fear or excitement. The old stories say that when the watchers walk, changes are coming. The shadows move before the substance follows. Really, Amy? Basil protested, but her sister had already retreated into her habitual silence, leaving her cryptic words to hang in the air like the fog that still pressed against the windows. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, rattling the shutters and sending leaves scattering across the terrace. Miss Marple sipped her brandy thoughtfully, her mind already beginning to catalogue the small inconsistencies and curious details that had marked their evening's adventure. The candle in the sealed window troubled her most of all, for if someone had indeed been moving about in that abandoned wing, the question was not merely how they had gained access, but why they had chosen to reveal their presence so dramatically to a group of unsuspecting guests on a simple historical tour. The fog pressed closer to the glass, and Miss Marple found herself wondering what other secrets Lantern Gate might be hiding in its shadowed corners and sealed passages. Chapter 3. Miss Marple finds a feather in the sconce, for brandy had done much to restore the party's spirits, and the conversation in the oak-panelled hall had gradually shifted from mysterious shadows to more conventional topics. Captain Dane was discussing his preliminary survey work with Basil Loughton, while Julia Venn made notes about the evening's events for her potential television feature. Dr. Crane had settled into a comfortable chair near the fire, examining specimens of fungi she had collected during their walk, and Gideon Marks was studying the architectural details of the hall with the calculating eye of a professional valuer. Miss Marple had positioned herself near one of the tall mullioned windows, ostensibly admiring the carved stonework, but in reality, observing her fellow guests with the quiet attention that had served her so well in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry had engaged Amy Lowton in conversation about local folklore, though the shy woman seemed more inclined to listen than to share her considerable knowledge. It was while moving quietly about the room, her elderly frame allowing her to pass almost unnoticed, that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something peculiar. Along the panelled walls, a series of wrought-iron sconces held electric bulbs disguised as candle flames, providing atmospheric lighting that complemented the central chandelier. Most of these were cold to the touch, their illumination provided by the main lighting circuit, but one sconce near the entrance to what appeared to be a corridor leading toward the domestic quarters retained a distinct warmth. Miss Marple paused, her keen eyes studying the fixture with interest. The sconce was of Tudor design, matching the period of the house, with elaborate ironwork that had been lovingly maintained. The electric bulb within was currently unlit, yet the metal housing was noticeably warm, as if it had been switched on recently and only just extinguished. Fascinating craftsmanship, isn't it? Basil Luton's voice came from behind her, causing her to turn with a polite smile. Indeed, Mr. Lowton, the attention to detail is remarkable. These sconces appear to be original to the house. Quite right, though we've had to modernize the electrical fittings, of course. Most of them are controlled by the main switches, though a few retain individual controls for practical purposes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers hovering near the warm metal. This particular one seems to have been in use recently. The housing is still quite warm. Basil frowned slightly, reaching to touch the sconce himself. How odd! I don't recall switching on any of the individual lights this evening. We've been relying on the chandelier and the firelight for atmosphere. As he spoke, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something unusual. Wedged behind the small thumbscrew that would have once adjusted the wick of a real candle, a wisp of grey protruded from the ironwork. With a careful movement of one long practiced in extracting delicate objects from awkward places, she worked the item free. My goodness, she murmured, holding her discovery up to the firelight. A feather! It was indeed a feather, but not the common brown or black plumage one might expect to find in an old house. This was a long, elegant grey feather with distinctive markings that Miss Marple recognized immediately from her years of country living. A heron feather, she observed quietly, from a grey heron unless I'm much mistaken. Basil stared at the feather in puzzlement. But that's impossible. How could such a thing come to be wedged in a wall sconce? And a grey heron, they're marsh birds. While we do have some wetlands on the property, the birds rarely venture near the house itself. Their quiet conversation had attracted the attention of the other guests. Captain Dane approached with professional interest, his surveyor's training making him naturally curious about anything unusual in the building structure. May I? He asked, examining the feather with practiced attention. Definitely from a grey heron. A dark bird, I should say, from the size and condition. But as Mr. Lowton observes, it's highly unusual to find such a specimen inside a dwelling. Dr. Crane joined them, her scientific background making her particularly qualified to comment. Grey herons are indeed creatures of the marshlands and waterways. They're quite large birds, with a wingspan that can exceed 5 feet. They're also remarkably shy and would be unlikely to enter a building voluntarily. Could it have been brought in by someone? Julia Venn suggested, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. Perhaps as part of some ritual or ceremony connected to the house's history. Amy Lowton had approached the group silently, her pale eyes fixed on the feather with an intensity that seemed almost fearful. The old stories, she whispered, speak of the heron as a guardian of the marshlands. They say the bird carries messages between the world of the living and the realm of shadows. Amy, please, her brother protested, but she continued as if he had not spoken. When a heron's feather is found within walls meant to shelter, It means the boundaries have been crossed. The watchers are no longer content to remain in their proper place. Gideon Marks gave a nervous laugh. Surely we're reading too much into what might be a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Birds do sometimes find their way into old buildings. Perhaps this feather has been there for years. Miss Marple examined the feather more closely, noting its condition with the thoroughness that came naturally to her. I think not, Mr. Marks. The feather shows no signs of age or deterioration. The natural oils are still present, and there's no fading of the coloration. This was placed here recently, I would say, within the last day or two. But who would do such a thing, Basil asked, his scholarly composure beginning to show signs of strain. And why? What possible purpose could be served by placing a heron feather in a wall sconce? Miss Marple turned the feather thoughtfully in her fingers, noting how the warm sconce had provided the perfect environment to preserve its condition. Perhaps, she said gently, it was intended as a message, or possibly as evidence of someone's presence in parts of the house where they should not have been. The implications of her words were not lost on the assembled group. If someone had indeed been moving about the house undetected, gaining access to areas that should have been secure, then the shadow at the sealed window took on a more sinister significance. Captain Dane cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should consider the possibility of, shall we say, unauthorized entry. As someone familiar with security matters, I can assure you that even the most carefully sealed building can be penetrated by someone with sufficient determination and knowledge. But why? Julia pressed. What could anyone hope to gain by sneaking about an old house? There's surely nothing of great value here, and if there were, wouldn't it be simpler to attempt a conventional burglary? Dr. Crane had been studying the sconce itself during this discussion, a methodical mind working through the physical evidence. The positioning is quite deliberate, she observed. The feather was carefully wedged behind the thumbscrew, where it would be protected but still discoverable by someone looking closely. This wasn't a random occurrence, or the result of a bird accidentally losing a feather. Someone placed it there intentionally. Miss Marple nodded approvingly at the doctor's reasoning. Exactly so. Which suggests that our mysterious visitor wished their presence to be known, at least eventually. The question is whether this discovery was intended for Mr. Loughton specifically, or whether it was meant for anyone observant enough to notice the anomaly. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the panelled walls, and outside the fog pressed ever closer to the windows. The comfortable atmosphere of the evening had been replaced by something more troubling, the sense that Lambton Gate held secrets that someone was determined to reveal, one carefully placed clue at a time. Amy Luton clutched her notebook tighter, her lips moving silently as if reciting some half-remembered verse about herons and watchers, and the thin boundaries between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond the sealed passages of the old house. Chapter 4. The guest list with one extra name. The discovery of the heron feather had cast a subdued spell over the evening's proceedings, and it was with some relief that the party responded to Basil Loughton's suggestion that they adjourned to the great saloon for supper. The dining room, as their host referred to it with characteristic formality, occupied much of the ground floor of the main wing, and had clearly been restored with considerable care and expense. The long refectory table, polished to a mirror shine, was set with what Miss Marple recognized as good quality, if not exceptional, china and silver. Candles in tall brass holders provided flickering illumination that complemented the electric chandelier, and the mullioned windows had been draped with heavy curtains to shut out the fog-shrouded night. "I do hope you'll forgive the informal nature of our meal," Basil said, as he guided his guests to their places. Mrs. Hedges, who normally assists with the catering, was unfortunately taken ill this afternoon, so I'd had to manage with what provisions were already prepared. The supper itself proved to be perfectly adequate, consisting of cold meats, fresh bread, local cheese, and a selection of preserves that spoke well of Surrey's agricultural traditions. Miss Marple found herself seated between Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Crane, a positioning that allowed her to observe the other guests while maintaining the gentle conversation expected of a lady of her years and station. It was as they took their places that she noticed the peculiarity that would later prove so significant. At the head of the table, Basil had arranged small place cards in elegant script, each bearing the name of an expected guest. Miss Marple's own card was there, along with those for Mrs. Bantry, Captain Dane, Miss Venn, Mr. Marks, Dr. Crane, and their host himself. But there was an eighth card. "I say, Loughton," Captain Dane observed, settling into his chair with military precision, "you seem to have prepared for an additional guest. This card here reads, Reverend T. Ellison. Are we expecting a clergyman to join us?" Basil looked up from carving the cold joint, his expression genuinely puzzled for a moment before clearing into what appeared to be embarrassment. "How very odd. I don't recall preparing a card for any Reverend Ellison. In fact, I specifically remember that Reverend Clement from the village church declined my invitation due to a prior engagement." Amy Loughton, who had been arranging her napkin with nervous precision, looked up sharply at the mention of the name. "There is no Reverend Ellison in this district," she said with unusual firmness. "I know all the clergy within 20 miles, having catalogued their parish records for my folklore research. No T. Ellison has served in any local church, past or present." "Perhaps it's a mistake," Julia Vem suggested diplomatically. "A slip of memory when preparing the cards. We all occasionally write down names without conscious thought." Gideon Marks picked up the offending card, examining it with the thoroughness he might have applied to a property deed. "The handwriting appears identical to the other cards," he observed. "Same ink, same pen stroke. If it's a mistake, it's a remarkably consistent one." Miss Marple accepted a plate from their host while studying the mystery card with interest. The script was indeed identical to that of the other place cards, executed in the same careful hand that bespoke Basil's scholarly background. The cardstock was the same, the ink the same deep blue, and there was no evidence of hesitation or afterthought in the writing. "Mr. Loughton," she said gently, "you mentioned that you typed the invitations yourself. Did you perhaps also type a list of guests when preparing these place cards?" Basil paused in his serving, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes, indeed I did. I prepared a typed list yesterday evening to ensure I haven't forgotten anyone. Let me see. There was yourself and Mrs. Bantry, Captain Dane, Miss Venn, Mr. Marks, Dr. Crane, and myself. 7 names in total. I'm quite certain I typed only 7 names." "And where is this typed list now?" Miss Marple inquired with the air of someone asking about the weather. "In my study, I believe. I used it this afternoon when preparing the place cards." Basil set down the carving knife and moved toward a side table, where a leather portfolio lay open. From it he extracted a single sheet of typing paper, which he examined with growing perplexity. "This is most extraordinary. The list shows 8 names, including one for Rev. T. Ellison, but I distinctly remember typing only 7. He handed the paper to Miss Marple, who studied it with the careful attention she might have given to an important document. The typing was neat and professional, executed on what appeared to be a standard office typewriter. 7 names were listed in alphabetical order, but inserted between Dr. Crane and Captain Dane was indeed Reverend T. Ellison. The typing appeared uniform throughout, with no obvious signs that the 8th name had been added later. "How very curious," she murmured, passing the list to Captain Dane. "The insertion appears to have been made with the same typewriter, using the same ribbon, yet you're certain you typed only 7 names originally." Dr. Crane, who had been following the discussion with scientific interest, leaned forward. "Is it possible that someone had access to your study between yesterday evening and this afternoon? Someone who might have used your typewriter to add the additional name?" Amy Loughton had grown increasingly agitated during this conversation, her fingers worrying the edge of her folklore notebook. "The old stories speak of uninvited guests," she whispered. "Spirits who write their own names in the book of the living demanding recognition and acknowledgement." "Amy, really," her brother protested, though his usual scholarly composure seemed somewhat strained. "We must look for rational explanations. Perhaps I suffered a momentary lapse of memory, or there was some confusion in my notes." Gideon Marks had been unusually quiet during this exchange, Miss Marple noted, his attention focused on his plate rather than the mystery at hand. When he did speak, his voice carried a forced lightness that didn't quite convince. Surely the simplest explanation is that Mr. Luton intended to invite a local clergyman, typed the name automatically, and then forgot about it when the invitation was declined. These things happen to the best of us. But as my sisters pointed out, Basil replied, there is no Reverend T. Ellison in this area. I would hardly have invented such a person, and I keep meticulous records of all local clergy for my historical research. Miss Marple carefully folded the typed list and handed it back to their host. Perhaps, she suggested with her characteristic gentleness, someone wished to ensure that Reverend Ellison's presence would be noted this evening, even if he could not attend in person. The implication of her words was not lost on the assembled company. If someone had deliberately added the fictitious name to both the typed list and the place cards, it suggested a level of planning and access to the house that was deeply troubling. Julia Venn looked around the table with the sharp attention of a journalist sensing a story. You're suggesting that someone entered Mr. Loughton's study, used his typewriter to add a false name, and then ensured that a place card would be prepared for this non-existent clergyman. But why go to such elaborate lengths for what amounts to a practical joke? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes thoughtful, it wasn't intended as a joke at all. Perhaps it was meant as a message, or a warning. After all, clergymen are traditionally associated with matters of life and death, are they not? Outside, the wind had risen further, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the stone walls of the old house. The candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows that seemed to give life to the portraits hanging on the panelled walls. Amy Loughton clutched her notebook tighter and whispered something that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps an old charm against unseen dangers. The mysterious Reverend T. Ellison might not have joined them for supper, but his presence seemed to hover over the table like an uninvited ghost, demanding acknowledgement of secrets that someone was determined to bring into the light. Chapter 5. Footprints that stop on a rotten step. The remainder of supper had passed with somewhat strained conversation, the mystery of the extra place card casting a shadow over what should have been a pleasant social gathering. As the evening progressed, a light drizzle had begun to fall, pattering against the mullioned windows and adding to the general atmosphere of unease that seemed to have settled over Lantern Gates like the persistent fog. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the party began to disperse. Julia Venn was the first to make her excuses, citing an early morning appointment in London, followed shortly by Dr. Crane, who expressed a desire to examine her fungal specimens while they were still fresh. Captain Dane and Gideon Marks, however, seemed inclined to linger, the former expressing interest in making some preliminary measurements of the grounds while the weather held, and the latter apparently reluctant to venture out into the drizzling night. "I say, Loughton," Captain Dane remarked, consulting his pocket watch, "would you mind terribly if I took a quick look at those broken stairs in the south wing? I noticed them during our walk, and I'd like to assess the structural damage for my survey notes. Won't take but a few minutes." Basil looked somewhat surprised by the request. "The south wing stairs? I'm afraid they're in rather dangerous condition, Captain. The local builder who examined them last month advised strongly against anyone attempting to use them." "Quite understandable," Dane replied with military confidence. "I shan't actually climb them, merely examine the damage from a safe distance. My engineering training, you know. I can usually spot structural problems that others might miss." Gideon Marks, who had been gathering his coat and gloves, paused at this announcement. "Actually, I might join you, if you don't mind the company. I confess I'm curious about the extent of the damage myself. It could affect the property's long-term value considerably." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing this exchange while helping Mrs. Bantry with her wrap, felt a small stirring of unease. There was something in the studied casualness of both men's interest that struck her as not quite natural, though she could not have explained precisely why. "Do be careful," Amy Loughton called after them as they headed toward the entrance hall. "The old stories warn against disturbing the sealed places after dark. Some boundaries are meant to remain unbroken." Her brother sighed audibly. "Amy, please. Captain Dane is perfectly capable of examining a staircase without supernatural interference." The two men departed into the drizzling night, their voices fading as they made their way around the side of the house toward the abandoned south wing. Miss Marple accepted Basil's offer of a final cup of tea before her own departure, though she found herself listening for the sound of the men's return rather than concentrating on the conversation. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when they heard footsteps on the gravel drive, followed by the sound of the front door opening. Captain Dane appeared first, his hair damp from the drizzle, and his expression somewhat grim. "Worse than I thought, I'm afraid," he announced, accepting a towel from their host. "The structural damage is quite extensive. I wouldn't recommend anyone venturing near those stairs, even for a cursory examination." Gideon Marks followed moments later, brushing raindrops from his coat. "Quite right," he agreed. "We barely had a proper look before deciding it was too dangerous to proceed. The wood is completely rotten in places. I heard timbers creaking just from our walking nearby." Miss Marple noted that both men seemed somewhat breathless, as if they had been moving more quickly than a simple examination would require. She also observed that while Captain Dane's boots showed evidence of contact with wet grass and mud, Mr. Marks's shoes appeared remarkably clean for someone who had supposedly been tramping about the grounds in drizzling rain. The party broke up shortly thereafter, with arrangements made for various guests to collect items they had left behind the following day. Mrs. Bantry's chauffeur, who had been waiting patiently in the village inn, arrived promptly to collect the two ladies, and they took their leave of Lantern Gate with expressions of gratitude for an unusual and memorable evening. It was the next morning, while taking her customary early walk in the gardens of Gossington Hall, that Miss Marple found herself thinking about the events of the previous evening. The combination of mysterious shadows, unexplained feathers, and fictitious clergymen seemed to suggest a pattern, though she could not yet discern its ultimate purpose. Her contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who appeared at the breakfast table in a state of considerable excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess what's happened. I've just had the most extraordinary telephone call from young Dr. Morrison in the village. It seems there's been some sort of incident at Lantern Gate during the night." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "What sort of incident, my dear?" "Well, it's rather confusing, but apparently someone noticed footprints this morning. Fresh ones made after the rain stopped, leading to those broken stairs in the south wing that Captain Dane was so interested in examining." "Indeed? And what makes these footprints particularly noteworthy?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "That's just it, Jane. According to Dr. Morrison, who heard it from the postman, the print shows someone climbing up the stairs, but there are no corresponding prints coming back down. And here's the strangest part. One of the upper steps has completely given way under someone's weight, snapped clean through, with splinters scattered all about." Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention she reserved for particularly significant details. "How very curious. And I suppose no one has any idea who might have been climbing those dangerous stairs in the middle of the night. That's just what makes it so mysterious. The footprints are quite clear, apparently. Good solid boot prints going up, but then they simply stop at the broken step. It's as if whoever made them simply vanished into thin air." Miss Marple rose from the breakfast table and moved to the window, gazing out at the Surrey countryside with thoughtful eyes. The morning was clear and bright, a marked contrast to the fog and drizzle of the previous evening, and she found herself wondering what other evidence the night might have left behind at Lantern Gate. "I think, my dear Dolly, that we should perhaps pay a call on Mr. Loughton this morning. Purely as concerned guests, you understand, to ensure that no harm has come to the property during the night." Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "What a splendid idea, Jane. And perhaps we might take a look at these mysterious footprints ourselves. After all, you do have such a talent for noticing things that others might overlook." As they prepared for their morning visit, Miss Marple found herself recalling Captain Dane's breathless appearance the night before, and Mr. Marks's remarkably clean shoes. The footprints that led up but not down suggested someone had found an alternative means of descent, or perhaps had never intended to return by the same route. Either possibility opened intriguing questions about the true purpose of the previous evening's examination of the south wing stairs, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that structural damage had been the least of the two men's concerns. Chapter 6. An oil lamp filled with rainwater. The morning sun had burned away the last vestiges of fog by the time Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry arrived at Lantern Gate, revealing the Tudor manor in all its ancient dignity. The twin stone lanterns at the gate-posts stood sentinel in the clear light, and Miss Marple once again noted how the right-hand lantern leaned at its peculiar angle, as if something beneath the earth had shifted the very foundations. Their reception at the house, however, was far from the cordial welcome they had received the previous evening. The front door was opened not by Basil Lowton himself, but by a red-faced constable whose presence immediately suggested that something serious had occurred during the night. "I'm afraid Mr. Lowton isn't receiving visitors at present, ladies," the constable said, with the apologetic firmness of one carrying out unpleasant duties. "There's been an incident, you see, and Inspector Slack is conducting inquiries." Before either lady could respond, a piercing scream echoed from somewhere within the house, followed by the sound of running footsteps and agitated voices. The constable looked uncertain, torn between his duty to guard the entrance and his obvious desire to investigate the source of the commotion. "That sounded like Amy Lowton," Mrs. Bantry observed with concern. "Perhaps we should—" Her words were cut short by the appearance of Inspector Slack himself, his familiar bulk filling the doorway, and his expression bearing the particular mixture of irritation and self-importance that Miss Marple remembered from previous encounters. "Miss Marple," he said with resigned recognition, "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to find you here. News travels fast in the countryside, doesn't it?" "We came merely to inquire after Mr. Lowton's welfare," Miss Marple replied mildly. "We heard there had been some sort of incident during the night." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that he was debating whether to send them away immediately or to make use of their presence as witnesses to the previous evening's events. Practicality won, as Miss Marple had suspected it would. "Well, since you're here, you might as well come in. But mind you don't touch anything, and stay out of the way while I conduct my investigation." They were escorted through the oak-panelled hall, where Miss Marple noted that the warm wall sconce from which she had extracted the heron feather now stood cold and unused. The great saloon, scene of their supper the previous evening, showed signs of hasty abandonment, with teacups still sitting on side tables and newspapers scattered about as if someone had been interrupted in their morning routine. The true focus of the morning's drama, however, lay at the foot of the staircase leading to the south wing's upper floors. There, in the most unnatural position, lay the still form of Basil Lowton. His scholarly features peaceful in death, but his neck twisted at an angle that spoke eloquently of the violence of his fall. Amy Lowton sat huddled in a nearby chair, her folklore notebook clutched to her chest and her pale eyes wide with shock. Dr. Morrison, the village physician, was completing his preliminary examination of the body, while Inspector Slack stood with his notebook at the ready, clearly frustrated by the complexity of the scene before him. "As far as I can determine," Dr. Morrison was saying, "death was instantaneous, caused by a broken neck sustained in the fall. The body shows no other signs of violence or struggle." Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the details of the scene with professional interest. Basil Lowton lay at the foot of the wooden staircase that led to the sealed upper floors of the south wing, the same stairs that Captain Dane and Gideon Marks had examined the previous evening. One step, approximately 3/4 of the way up, had snapped completely through, leaving jagged splinters of rotten wood scattered on the steps below. But it was not the broken step that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. Clutched in the dead man's right hand was a soggy piece of cardstock that she recognized immediately as one of the place cards from the previous evening's supper. Even from her position several feet away, she could make out the words Rev. T. Ellison, written in the same careful script that had puzzled them all. "Found him just like this at 6 o'clock this morning," Inspector Slack was explaining to his constable. "Miss Amy Lowton discovered the body when she came down for her early morning tea. Claims she heard nothing during the night, but then she admits to being a heavy sleeper." Amy Lowton looked up at the mention of her name, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard the wind in the trees and rain against my windows, but no sounds from within the house. Basil was always an early riser. When I came downstairs and saw, she gestured helplessly toward her brother's still form. Miss Marple approached the scene with the careful steps of one accustomed to examining evidence without disturbing it. Near the foot of the staircase, positioned as if it had been providing illumination during the night, stood a brass oil lamp of the type commonly used during power failures in old houses. The lamp was cold to the touch, its wick unlit, but what struck Miss Marple as particularly odd was the presence of what appeared to be water in the oil reservoir. "Inspector Slack," she said quietly, "might I draw your attention to this lamp?" The inspector approached with obvious reluctance, his manner suggesting that he would prefer to conduct his investigation without the assistance of elderly ladies, no matter how well-meaning. "What about it? Looks like an ordinary oil lamp to me." "Indeed it does. But observe the reservoir if you would. That appears to be water, not paraffin oil." Inspector Slack bent closer, his expression shifting from irritation to puzzlement. "Water? But that makes no sense. How could an oil lamp contain water?" Dr. Morrison, who had completed his examination of the body, joined them at the lamp. "Miss Marple is quite right. The reservoir is filled with water, and rainwater at that, judging by the clarity. But there's no obvious source. The nearest window is tightly shuttered, and I can see no gaps in the ceiling above." Miss Marple tilted her head back to examine the Tudor beams and plaster ceiling above the staircase. Most curious indeed. One would expect to find evidence of a leak if water had entered from above, yet the ceiling appears perfectly sound. Amy Lowton had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, her fingers worrying the edges of her notebook. "The old stories speak of lamps that fail when evil walks abroad," she whispered. "When the protective light is extinguished, darkness enters and claims its due." "Miss Lowton," Inspector Slack said with strained patience, "I need facts, not folklore. Can you tell me anything about your brother's activities last night after his guests departed?" Amy's pale eyes darted nervously around the group. "He said he wanted to check the house before retiring. He always did that, making sure the doors were locked and the lights properly extinguished. He carried that lamp because he didn't trust the electric lighting in the older parts of the house." "And what time would that have been?" "Perhaps 11 o'clock or a little after. I went to my room shortly after the last guest left, and I could hear him moving about downstairs for some time." Miss Marple studied the position of the body relative to the broken step above. It would appear that Mr. Lowton climbed the stairs, perhaps investigating something, and the rotten step gave way beneath his weight. But why would he have ventured onto stairs he knew to be dangerous? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the air of one trying to impose order on chaos. "According to the guests I've interviewed this morning, there was considerable discussion yesterday evening about mysterious shadows and unexplained phenomena in the sealed wing. Perhaps Lowton thought he heard something and went to investigate." "With an oil lamp that contained water instead of fuel," Miss Marple observed gently. "How very puzzling that seems." Dr. Morrison had been examining the lamp more closely during this conversation. "There's something else odd about this lamp, Inspector. The wick shows signs of having been recently lit. There are traces of soot around the glass chimney. Yet if the reservoir contained water, the lamp couldn't possibly have burned." The implications of this observation settled over the group like a chill. If the lamp had been burning with the oil and had somehow been filled with water during the night, it suggested a deliberate act by someone who'd been present in the house after Basil Lowton's death. Amy Lowton began to rock back and forth in her chair, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of one reciting an oft-repeated verse. "When the lantern fails and shadows creep, when the watchers wake from their ancient sleep, then shall the guardian price be paid, and the reckoning come to the lantern's shade." Inspector Slack looked as if he would very much like to have Amy Lowton removed to a place where her cryptic pronouncements could not complicate his investigation further. Miss Marple, however, listened with careful attention, her experience having taught her that even the most seemingly nonsensical folklore often contained kernels of practical truth. The soggy place card in the dead man's hand continued to puzzle her most of all. Why would Basil Lawton have been carrying the card for the mysterious Reverend T. Ellison during his late-night exploration of the South Wing? And who had filled the oil lamp with rainwater, transforming what should have been a source of light into an instrument as useless as it was inexplicable? Chapter 7. Midnight in the Walled Fernery. Inspector Slack had wasted no time in cordoning off the South Wing with his characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple suspected that his haste owed more to a desire to prevent further complications than to any particular insight into the case. Yellow tape now blocked access to the fatal staircase, and a constable had been posted to ensure that no unauthorized persons could disturb what the inspector was pleased to call the scene of the accident. For accident it had been officially deemed, despite the troubling questions raised by the water-filled lamp and the soggy place card. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple observed, had a marked preference for straightforward explanations that did not require him to delve too deeply into the murky waters of human motivation and deception. Clear case of misadventure, he had pronounced to Dr. Morrison. Gentleman investigates strange noises in the night, ventures onto unsafe stairs, step gives way, fatal fall. Tragic, but hardly mysterious. Miss Marple had made no comment on this assessment, though her expression suggested that she found the inspector's certainty somewhat premature. Instead, she had quietly requested permission to pay her respects to the bereaved Miss Amy Lawton, a request that Inspector Slack could hardly refuse without appearing churlish. Amy had been installed in the morning room, a pleasant chamber overlooking the gardens, where she sat surrounded by her folklore notebooks and the various parish records that comprised her life's work. The shock of her brother's death had, if anything, intensified her otherworldly manner, and she spoke in the disconnected phrases of one whose mind has retreated to safer, more familiar territories. The watchers are restless, she murmured, as Miss Marple settled into a chair beside her. When the guardian falls, the boundaries weaken. Old debts must be paid. You speak of watchers, Miss Lawton, Miss Marple said gently. Are these part of the local folklore you have studied so extensively? Amy's pale eyes focused on her visitor with something approaching clarity. The grey heron is the herald of the watchers. When its feather is found where no heron should be, it means the sealed places have been opened. The old protections are failing. Miss Marple remembered the feather she'd discovered in the walled sconce, and the deliberate care with which it had been placed. And what did the old stories say about such times? That only truth can restore the balance. Secrets buried in darkness must be brought to light, no matter how painful the revelation. Amy clutched her notebook more tightly. Basil never understood. He thought history was merely facts to be catalogued and displayed. But the past lives, Miss Marple, it reaches out through the years to claim its due. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Crane, who had returned to Lambton Gate upon hearing the news of Basil's death. The pathologist's scientific mind was clearly troubled by the inconsistencies in the official version of events. I've been thinking about that lamp, she said without preamble. The water didn't appear by accident. Someone filled that reservoir deliberately and recently. But why? What possible purpose could be served by rendering a lamp useless? Miss Marple considered this question while gazing out at the walled fernery that lay beyond the morning room windows. The ancient brick enclosure, overgrown with moss and ivy, had clearly been a place of beauty in its heyday, though now it showed the neglect common to such specialized garden features. Perhaps, she suggested quietly, the lamp was meant to fail at a crucial moment. If someone wished to ensure darkness rather than light during a particular period, filling the oil reservoir with water would be an effective method. Dr. Crane nodded thoughtfully. A method that would not be immediately apparent, unlike simply extinguishing the flame. But that suggests premeditation, doesn't it? Someone planning well in advance for the events of last night. As the afternoon wore on, Inspector Slack's investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness, if little imagination. The various guests from the previous evening were interviewed again, their movements and observations carefully recorded. Captain Dane confirmed that he and Mr. Marks had examined the south wing stairs, but had found them too dangerous to approach closely. Julia then provided a detailed account of the mysterious shadow they had observed at the shuttered window. Each piece of testimony was dutifully noted, though Miss Marple suspected that Inspector Slack was fitting the facts to his predetermined conclusion, rather than allowing them to suggest alternative possibilities. It was well past midnight when Miss Marple found herself unable to sleep, her mind too active with the day's revelations to permit rest. Mrs. Bantry had retired hours earlier, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day's events, but Miss Marple felt drawn to return to Lantern Gate under cover of darkness. The night was clear and still, with a full moon providing adequate illumination for her careful progress through the grounds. She had borrowed a small electric torch from Mrs. Bantry's emergency supplies, though she used it sparingly, preferring to rely on her knowledge of the property's layout gained during the previous evening's lantern walk. The walled fernery drew her like a magnet, its ancient bricks silver in the moonlight, and its interior hidden by decades of unchecked growth. The wooden door, she discovered, was secured by nothing more substantial than a rusted latch that yielded easily to gentle pressure. Inside, the fernery was a world unto itself, enclosed and mysterious. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the ivy-covered walls, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with every breath of wind. The air was thick with the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation and the particular dampness that speaks of places where water collects and lingers. Dr. Crane was already there. The pathologist looked up from her examination of what appeared to be a collection of organic debris, her expression showing no surprise at Miss Marple's appearance. "I had a feeling you might find your way here eventually," she said quietly. "There are things in this fernery that Inspector Slack should see, but I suspect he won't appreciate their significance." Miss Marple approached carefully, her torch beam revealing the objects that had captured Dr. Crane's attention. Scattered among the ferns and mosses was what appeared to be the lining of a large bird's nest, composed of dried grasses, small twigs, and various organic materials that spoke of careful construction by a creature of considerable size. A heron's nest, Dr. Crane confirmed, or rather the materials from one. They've been brought here recently, probably within the last few days, but that's not all. She led Miss Marple deeper into the fernery, where her torch beam revealed a length of surveyor's measuring tape, the bright orange marking making it clearly visible against the dark earth. Nearby, partially concealed beneath a cluster of ferns, lay what appeared to be a spent cartridge case. "From a flare pistol," Dr. Crane explained, handling the cartridge case with scientific precision. "Fired recently, judging by the condition of the brass, and there's something else you should see." She guided Miss Marple to a patch of ground where several varieties of fungi grew in profusion. Even in the limited light of the torch beam, Miss Marple could see that some of the specimens glowed with a faint ethereal blue luminescence. "Marsh fungi," Dr. Crane explained. "Quite rare, and with the peculiar property of becoming luminescent when bruised or damaged. The light is faint but unmistakable, particularly in complete darkness." Miss Marple studied the various objects with the careful attention of one assembling the pieces of a complex puzzle. The heron's nest materials connected to the feather in the wall sconce. The surveyor's tape suggested professional equipment, possibly belonging to Captain Dane. The flare cartridge spoke of deliberate signals or illumination, and the glowing fungi provided a possible explanation for mysterious lights, observed when none should logically exist. "Someone has been using this fernery as a storage place," she observed quietly. "But for what purpose? And why abandon these materials here where they might be discovered?" Dr. Crane's expression was grim in the torchlight. "I suspect, Miss Marple, that last night's events did not proceed entirely according to plan. Someone may have been forced to abandon equipment they had intended to retrieve." As they prepared to leave the fernery, Miss Marple paused to examine one final detail. Near the entrance, pressed into the soft earth, were the clear impressions of boot prints, their pattern and size suggesting they had been made by someone of considerable weight and stature. The same boots, she realized, that had left their mark on the rotted stairs of the south wing, ascending but never descending by the same route. Chapter 8. the field notebook inked in reverse. The following morning brought with it a crispness that seemed to cut through the lingering atmosphere of mystery and tragedy that had settled over Lantern Gate. Miss Marple arrived early, ostensibly to offer further comfort to the bereaved Amy Lowton, but in reality driven by the various questions that her midnight expedition to the walled fernery had raised rather than answered. She found the household in a state of subdued activity. Inspector Slack had departed the previous evening, satisfied with his accident theory, and eager to close what he considered a straightforward case. Amy Lowton remained in seclusion, tended by a neighbour who had arrived to assist with the practical arrangements that death inevitably requires. The other guests from the fatal evening had either returned to their respective homes or, in the case of Captain Dane, had taken rooms at the village inn pending the completion of his survey work. It was this last detail that Miss Marple found particularly interesting, and she was not surprised to encounter the retired army officer in the oak-panelled hall, apparently engaged in organising his surveying equipment. His field notebook lay open on the refectory table, its pages spread to dry before the warmth of the fireplace. "Good morning, Captain Dane," she said pleasantly. "How thoughtful of you to continue with your survey work despite the tragic circumstances. I'm sure Mr. Lowton would have appreciated such dedication." Captain Dane looked up from his instruments with the slightly guilty expression of one caught in an activity that might appear unseemly. "Miss Marple?" "Yes. Well, I felt it important to complete what I had begun. Poor Lowton was quite keen on having accurate measurement of the property, and it seems a fitting tribute to his memory." Miss Marple approached the table where his notebook lay drying, her keen eyes taking in the careful sketches and measurements that covered its pages. The work was clearly professional in quality, executed with the precision one would expect from someone with military engineering training. What caught her attention, however, was not the quality of the work, but rather its peculiar presentation. "How fascinating," she murmured, studying the open pages more closely. "Your sketches of the lantern bases are quite detailed, though I confess I find the notation somewhat unusual." Captain Dane glanced at the notebook with apparent puzzlement. "Unusual in what way?" "The writing appears to be in reverse," Miss Marple observed gently. "Mirror writing, I believe it's called. Quite difficult to execute unless one has practiced the technique extensively." Indeed, the annotations beside the careful architectural drawings were inscribed in a backward script that would require a mirror to read properly. The effect was striking, giving the entire notebook an air of deliberate secrecy that seemed at odds with the straightforward nature of a property survey. Captain Dane's expression shifted from puzzlement to what might have been embarrassment. "Ah, yes. Rather an odd habit of mine, I'm afraid. Picked it up during my military service when we needed to keep sensitive information secure. The practice has become so ingrained that I sometimes do it without thinking." Miss Marple nodded with understanding, though her sharp eyes noted that the ink in several of the reverse notations appeared remarkably fresh, with a tackiness that suggested recent composition rather than the dry, settled appearance of older writing. "How very interesting. And these particular sketches of the stone lanterns, they show considerable detail about the internal structure. Hollow core appears to be noted here, though naturally I'm reading it in reverse." "Standard surveying practice," Captain Dane replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. "Old structures often contain hidden spaces or structural weaknesses that aren't immediately apparent from external examination." Miss Marple picked up the notebook with the careful movements of one handling a delicate object, ostensibly to examine it more closely, but actually to test the condition of the ink on the pen's nib. Her fingertip came away with a faint smear of blue-black ink mixed with what appeared to be organic matter of a distinctly luminescent quality. "Your pen seems to have collected some unusual residue," she observed, holding her finger up to catch the morning light streaming through the mullioned windows. Even in the bright daylight, there was a faint phosphorescent quality to the smear that reminded her immediately of the glowing fungi she and Dr. Crane had observed in the walled fernery. Captain Dane's face had gone quite pale, and he reached somewhat hastily for his notebook. "Probably just picked up some moss or lichen while I was working near the stone structures. These old properties are covered in all manner of organic growth. Indeed they are, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, allowing him to reclaim his notebook while making a mental note of his obvious discomfort. Though I believe Dr. Crane mentioned that certain marsh fungi have the remarkable property of glowing when bruised or disturbed. Such a curious phenomenon of nature, don't you think? Before Captain Dane could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Gideon Marks, who entered the hall with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing practical affairs during times of crisis. "Captain Dane, Miss Marple," he said with professional courtesy tinged by the gravity of recent events. "I trust I'm not interrupting anything important. I've come to discuss some practical matters with Miss Amy regarding the estate's future." Miss Marple observed that Mr. Marks appeared considerably more composed than he had during the previous evening's dramatic events. His shoes, she noted, were once again remarkably clean, despite his having presumably walked from the village inn across country lanes that remained muddy from the recent rain. "Mr. Marks," she said with her characteristic gentleness, "how thoughtful of you to concern yourself with Miss Loughton's welfare during such a difficult time. Though I hope you don't find it presumptuous of me to ask whether you've had occasion to return to the property since the tragic events of the night before last." Marks's expression showed a flicker of something that might have been caution. "Return? No, Miss Marple, I haven't been back to Lambton Gate since that evening. I've been staying at the inn, naturally enough, but I haven't had a reason to visit the grounds." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied smoothly, "though I couldn't help but notice that your shoes remain in such excellent condition, despite the muddy conditions we've been experiencing. You must have a most reliable bootblack at the inn." The observation hung in the air with the weight of unspoken implications. Captain Dane had resumed his examination of his surveying equipment with studied concentration, while Gideon Marks seemed to be weighing his response with unusual care. "Actually," Marks said after a moment's hesitation, "I did take the liberty of examining the exterior of the south wing yesterday morning, before the police arrived. Purely from a professional standpoint, you understand. I wanted to assess whether the structural damage might affect the property's value." Miss Marple nodded with apparent understanding. "How very conscientious of you. And did your examination reveal anything of significance?" "Nothing that wasn't already apparent from our inspection 2 evenings ago. The wing is clearly in poor condition, and the recent incident with the stairs only confirms the extent of the structural problems." Miss Marple glanced again at Captain Dane's notebook, where the mirror writing seemed to shimmer slightly in the firelight. The reverse script spoke of secrets deliberately concealed, while the phosphorescent residue on the pen suggested contact with materials that had no legitimate place in a straightforward property survey. "Gentlemen," she said, with the air of one reaching an important decision, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about one small matter. The stone lanterns at the gate have fascinated me since our arrival, particularly the one that leans so remarkably from the vertical. Captain Dane, your surveys must have provided some insight into the cause of such an unusual phenomenon." Captain Dane's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his notebook. "Merely the settling of old foundations, I should think. These ancient structures are constantly shifting as the ground beneath them adjusts to changing conditions." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though I couldn't help but wonder whether the lean might indicate something rather more interesting than simple subsidence. After all, if one were to discover that such a structure contained, shall we say, a hollow core, the implications might be quite significant indeed. The silence that followed her words was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of Amy Loughton's voice, reciting what sounded like fragments of old verses about watchers and guardians and the price that must be paid when ancient boundaries are crossed. Chapter 9. 2 gunshots, but only 1 cartridge. The tension in the oak-panelled hall had become almost palpable following Miss Marple's observation about the leaning stone lantern. Captain Dane's grip on his notebook had tightened perceptibly, while Gideon Marks seemed to be calculating his next words with the care of a chess player contemplating a crucial move. It was at this delicate moment that Constable Henderson arrived from the village, his bicycle propped against the front steps and his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple recognized him as one of Inspector Slack's more conscientious subordinates, a young man whose attention to detail often compensated for his superior's preference for hasty conclusions. "Begging your pardon, ladies and gentlemen," he said with the polite deference of one interrupting his betters, "but I've been instructed to gather some additional information about the events of 2 nights past. Specifically, Inspector Slack would like to know if anyone recalls hearing any unusual sounds during the evening hours." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Captain Dane and Mr. Marks, both of whom had suddenly developed an intense interest in the Persian carpet beneath their feet. "What sort of sounds, Constable?" she inquired gently. "Well, miss, there's been some discussion in the village about reports of what might have been gunshots around 11 o'clock that night. Mrs. Pemberton at the post office mentioned it to the inspector, and he thought it worth investigating." Captain Dane cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Gunshots seem rather an extreme interpretation, Constable. We did hear some sounds that might have been fireworks, or perhaps a motor car backfiring on the main road." "Fireworks, sir?" The constable made careful notes. "That would be unusual for the time of year, wouldn't it? And the weather was rather poor for outdoor celebrations." Gideon Marks shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Poachers, more likely. These rural areas always have problems with unauthorized hunting, particularly when the fog provides cover." Miss Marple listened to these explanations with the patient attention of one hearing a familiar but not entirely convincing story. "How many shots did Mrs. Pemberton report hearing, Constable?" "2 distinct reports, miss, about 10 minutes apart. She was quite specific about that detail, having noted the time on her mantelpiece clock." "Most observant of her," Miss Marple murmured. "And I suppose no physical evidence of these shots has been discovered?" Constable Henderson consulted his notebook with the thoroughness of youth compensating for inexperience. "That's rather the curious thing, miss. We'd found one spent cartridge case in the ground yesterday, from what appears to be a flare pistol. But if there were 2 shots, as Mrs. Pemberton maintains, one would expect to find 2 cartridges." The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of Amy Loughton's voice drifting from the morning room, where she continued her litany of half-remembered folklore. Miss Marple moved toward the window that offered a view of the south wing, her elderly frame allowing her to pass almost unnoticed, while the 2 men focused their attention on the constable's questions. "Perhaps," she suggested quietly, "the second shot misfired. Such things do happen with mechanical devices, particularly in damp conditions." Captain Dane's head snapped up with surprising sharpness. "Misfired? That's rather a specific technical assessment, Miss Marple." "Oh, I know very little about firearms, Captain, but my dear nephew Raymond is quite interested in such matters, and he's often mentioned that flare pistols are particularly susceptible to moisture and mechanical failure." She paused by the window, her keen eyes studying the damaged south wing with renewed interest. Of course, if such a misfire occurred in an enclosed space, it might well startle anyone in the vicinity, particularly someone who wasn't expecting the sound. Gideon Marks had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. "I'm not sure I follow your reasoning, Miss Marple." "Oh, quite simple. Really. If someone were using a flare pistol to create mysterious lights and sounds as part of some elaborate deception, a misfire at a crucial moment might disrupt their plans considerably. They might find themselves in an unexpected situation, perhaps even a dangerous one." Constable Henderson looked up from his notebook with growing interest. "Are you suggesting, miss, that these flare shots were connected to the mysterious phenomena the guests reported seeing?" "I'm suggesting nothing definitive, Constable. Merely observing that the timing seems remarkably coincidental. 2 shots heard around 11 o'clock, a flare cartridge found in the grounds, and poor Mr. Loughton discovered dead at the foot of the south wing stairs, with evidence suggesting he'd been investigating unusual activities." Miss Marple turned from the window to face the room's occupants directly. "There's also the matter of the oil lamp filled with rainwater. Such an unusual occurrence requires explanation, don't you think?" Captain Dane had begun gathering his surveying equipment with movements that suggested a desire to conclude the conversation as quickly as possible. "I'm afraid I must return to the village, Miss Marple. My survey work requires attention, and I wouldn't want to keep the inn waiting for their room." "Of course, Captain. Though before you go, might I ask about your experience with roofing systems? You mentioned having examined the structural damage to the south wing." "Standard military engineering training," he replied tersely, "though I failed to see the relevance." Miss Marple smiled with gentle persistence. "Well, I've been puzzling over how rainwater could have entered that oil lamp when the ceiling above showed no signs of leakage. It occurred to me that someone with knowledge of building systems might know of alternative methods for introducing water into enclosed spaces." She moved to the hearth, where a copper coal scuttle sat beside the fire tools. "For instance, a length of flexible tubing, perhaps survey tape, could be used to siphon water from a roof hopper down through a lamp chimney. The procedure would extinguish the flame and flood the oil reservoir, rendering the lamp useless at a predetermined time." The effect of her words on Captain Dane was immediate and dramatic. His face flushed, then paled, and his hands trembled slightly as he continued packing his equipment. "That's rather an elaborate theory, Miss Marple," Gideon Mark said with forced lightness. "Surely you're not suggesting that someone deliberately sabotaged Mr. Loughton's lamp?" "I'm suggesting that the physical evidence supports such a conclusion. A lamp that had been burning oil, suddenly filled with rainwater, speaks of human intervention, not natural phenomena." Constable Henderson had been taking careful notes throughout this exchange. "If I understand correctly, miss, you're proposing that someone used the first flare shot as a signal, then attempted to use the second to create some sort of distraction, but the pistol misfired in the stairwell, startling Mr. Loughton and causing him to lose his footing on the rotten step." "That would certainly explain the evidence we've discovered," Miss Marple replied, "including the curious circumstance of footprints ascending the stairs but not descending by the same route." Captain Dane straightened abruptly, his military bearing returning despite his obvious distress. "Miss Marple, I believe you are allowing your imagination to run away with you. These are serious accusations based on nothing more than coincidence and speculation." "Indeed they are serious, Captain. Which is why I believe Inspector Slack should be informed of all the relevant facts, including the contents of your notebook, with its reverse notations about hollow cores and stone structures." The morning light streaming through the mullioned windows seemed to catch the phosphorescent residue still visible on Captain Dane's pen, creating a faint blue glow that reminded everyone present of the luminescent fungi growing in the walled fernery. Outside, a grey heron called mournfully from the direction of the marshlands, its cry echoing across the grounds like a harbinger of revelations yet to come. Chapter 10. Truth strikes at the stroke of 6. The village church clock was striking 6 in the morning when Miss Marple requested that all the surviving guests from the fatal evening gather once more in the oak-panelled hall of Lantern Gate. Inspector Slack had been summoned from his breakfast, his expression bearing the particular blend of irritation and resignation that he reserved for occasions when Miss Marple's involvement in his cases had reached the point of inevitability. Amy Loughton sat pale and silent in her customary chair, clutching her folklore notebook like a talisman against the revelations she sensed were coming. Dr. Crane had arrived early, her scientific curiosity overcoming any reluctance to witness what promised to be an uncomfortable scene. Julia Venn, summoned from her London hotel by urgent telephone, perched on the edge of her seat, with the alert attention of one sensing an important story. Captain Dane and Gideon Marks occupied chairs at opposite ends of the room, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a tension that spoke eloquently of conspirators whose partnership had soured under the weight of unintended consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "I have asked you here this morning because I believe the time has come to illuminate the shadows that have gathered around Lantern Gate. The death of Mr. Basil Loughton was indeed tragic, but it was not the accident that it initially appeared to be." Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now see here, Miss Marple, I've investigated this matter thoroughly, and there's no evidence to suggest anything other than misadventure. With respect, Inspector, I believe there is considerable evidence, though it has been carefully concealed by those responsible." Miss Marple moved to stand beside the cold fireplace, a slight figure commanding attention through the quiet authority of absolute certainty. The deception began with Captain Dane's discovery of something remarkable hidden within the grounds of Lantern Gate. His survey work revealed that the leaning stone lantern at the gate was not merely the victim of subsidence, but had been deliberately tilted to conceal access to a hollow chamber within its base. Captain Dane's face had gone ashen, but he maintained his military bearing. "That's pure speculation, Miss Marple." "Is it, Captain?" Your notebook, with its careful mirror writing to ensure secrecy, specifically notes hollow core beside your sketches of the lantern foundations. The reverse script was your method of keeping sensitive information secure, just as you claimed, though not for the reasons you suggested. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "What you discovered, I believe, was a cache of Georgian silver plate, hidden during some long-ago crisis and forgotten by subsequent generations. The upright lantern stands as it was built, but the leaning one conceals a treasure that made certain people very excited indeed." Gideon Marks could no longer contain himself. Even if such a thing were true, which I'm not admitting, there would be nothing illegal about discovering and claiming abandoned property. "Quite correct, Mr. Marks. But you and Captain Dane had no legal claim to treasure found on Mr. Loughton's property, so you devised an elaborate scheme to frighten him into selling the estate at a considerable loss, whereupon you could purchase it through intermediaries and claim the treasure legitimately." Miss Marple gestured toward the wall sconce where she had discovered the heron feather. The plan required creating an atmosphere of supernatural menace. Captain Dane, with his access to military equipment, provided the flare pistol for mysterious lights. The heron feather was placed deliberately in that warm sconce to suggest otherworldly watchers. Mr. Marks, with his knowledge of the property gained during the sale process, knew how to move about the sealed south wing. Dr. Crane leaned forward with scientific interest. The luminescent fungi in the fernery, they were part of the deception as well. Indeed, bruised marsh fungi create an eerie blue glow that would enhance the supernatural atmosphere you were trying to create. The residue on Captain Dane's pen proves he handled such materials recently. Amy Loughton looked up from her notebook with sudden clarity. The old stories were true then, but not in the way I thought. The Watchers were real, but they were men, not spirits. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Your folklore knowledge was being used against your brother, Miss Loughton. Every supernatural manifestation was carefully designed to match the local legends you had documented so thoroughly." Inspector Slack had been following this explanation with growing comprehension. "So the shadow at the window, the mysterious place card for the non-existent Reverend, all part of the psychological campaign. The fictitious Reverend T. Ellison was added to Mr. Loughton's guest list and place cards to suggest spiritual intervention. Mr. Marks had ample opportunity to manipulate both the typed list and the place cards during his visits to discuss estate matters." Miss Marple moved to the window overlooking the south wing. The plan might have succeeded, but for one crucial miscalculation. On the night of Mr. Loughton's death, the second flare shot misfired in the stairwell, creating an unexpected sound that startled him while he was investigating the disturbances you had been creating. "The oil lamp filled with rainwater," Dr. Crane added, understanding dawning in her voice. "Precisely. Captain Dane used his surveyor's tape as a siphon, drawing water from the roof hopper down through the lamp's chimney. This ensured the lamp would fail at a crucial moment, plunging the stairwell into darkness just as Mr. Loughton approached." Captain Dane's composure finally cracked. "It was never meant to harm him. We only wanted to create atmosphere, to make him believe the house was haunted." "But when the flare misfired," Miss Marple continued relentlessly, "Mr. Loughton lost his footing on the rotten step that you had deliberately weakened during your earlier examination of the stairs. He fell, clutching the Reverend Ellison place card he had brought to investigate your fictional clergyman." Gideon Marks rose abruptly from his chair. "This is all speculation and fantasy. You can't prove any of it." "Can't I, Mr. Marks? Your remarkably clean shoes after supposedly tramping about muddy grounds suggest you used an alternative route, probably through the sealed wing itself. The heron's nest materials in the fernery came from your rucksack, used to pad the first piece of silver plate you retrieved from the hollow lantern. The phosphorescent residue on various surfaces shows exactly where you and Captain Dane have been. Inspector Slack stood with grim determination. Captain Dane, Mr. Marks, I'm arresting you both in connection with the death of Basil Lowton and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the two men were led away, Amy Lowton spoke for the first time since the revelations began. The Watchers have been unmasked, and the Guardian's death avenged. Perhaps now Lantern Gate can know peace. Miss Marple settled into a chair beside her. Your brother's passion for historical truth has triumphed, my dear. The real treasure of Lantern Gate was never the hidden silver, but the honest scholarship he represented. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last vestiges of fog and shadow that had shrouded the ancient manor. The twin stone lanterns stood sentinel at the gate, one upright and honest, the other leaning under the weight of secrets finally brought to light. Julia Venn closed her notebook with evident satisfaction. This will make a remarkable story, Miss Marple, though perhaps not quite the television program I originally envisioned. Truth often proves more compelling than fiction, Miss Venn, though I suspect the real heroes of this tale are the old stories themselves, which warned us from the beginning that when lanterns fail and shadows creep, the price of deception must inevitably be paid. As the guests departed and Amy Lowton began making arrangements for her brother's funeral, Miss Marple reflected that Lantern Gate would indeed find new purpose, perhaps as the youth hostel Amy had mentioned. The shadows beyond the Lantern Gate had been dispelled. An honest light could shine once more through the ancient windows of the Tudor manor,